In the entirety of the Union, there is no state quite like Florida. Along with the fourth largest economy of the nation, Florida boasts a plethora of natural and cultural value. But who were the people that made Florida the great state that it is? Who were... Andrew Jackson was a warrior. Born in a log cabin on the Carolinian border to a widowed Irish immigrant, Andrew Jackson's life was a battle from the moment he was born. His oldest brother died in service to the Revolutionary Army, and his remaining brother died from the cholera he contracted while he and Andrew were imprisoned for acting as couriers. It was here that Andrew Jackson gained his distinctive scar for disobeying the British officer who demanded he clean his shoes. Despite the harsh circumstances, by 1816, Jackson was both a distinguished legal mind, he briefly served as Justice of the Tennessee Supreme Court, and a decorated war hero for his courageous efforts during the War of 1812. Jackson had made himself quite the reputation for his victories against the British and native tribes. His reputation was so fearsome that, when he marched into Spanish-controlled Florida during the First Seminole War, Spain quickly agreed to terms of purchase. Even the mighty Spanish Empire was intimidated by Andrew Jackson. Jackson was the natural choice to be appointed the first governor of the territory. Jackson would serve in that office until the end of the year.
Andrew Jackson is not a name that most people would associate with Florida's history, but Andrew Jackson was heavily involved, at least in Florida becoming a U.S. territory. After the Battle of New Orleans, he became a famous military figure, and it was actually during that time period that he first made military incursions into Florida. It's what we call the First Seminole War. And that pressure was directly responsible, I believe, to the Adams-Onis Treaty, which was signed in 1819 between the U.S. And Spain, and that allowed Spain to relinquish control of Florida and the United States to acquire the Florida territories, thus completing the entire eastern seaboard, essentially, that they now control. And Jackson became the first military governor in 1821 and helped to transition the powers of government from the Spanish colonial powers to the U.S. government in 1821.
Born impoverished to a poor clergyman in New York, Henry Flagler dropped out of school after the 8th grade to work for a distant relative at his store in Ohio. This tragic turn of events, however, had a bright side. Flagler grew to learn a good deal of the mercantile trade. With the experience he garnered, Flagler felt he was ready to start his own business, investing $100,000, half of it borrowed money, to create a salt mining and production company with his brother-in-law. But the Civil War decimated demand for salt, and Flagler's company folded. However, fortune would yet favor Flagler when he entered business with the kindred spirit John Rockefeller. Together they would form Standard Oil, the company that would be synonymous with the economic boom of the late 19th century. With his fortune built, Henry had the means to vacation. He took his wife Mary down to Jacksonville, Florida, in hopes that the warm weather would do well to treat her illness. Unfortunately, her health did not improve, and Flagler was a widower. When Flagler remarried, he again traveled down to Florida. Given his dislike of the sparse accommodations of Jacksonville, he instead traveled further south to St. Augustine for his second honeymoon. Flagler loved St. Augustine. He built churches, hotels, a hospital, and more there. Eventually, he even purchased a railroad. Those railroads were the veins of industry. Where they went, capital followed. In a short time, Florida went from one of the most backwater states in the Union to a place that even a president could enjoy.
Henry Flagler first came to Florida during a period of tremendous growth in the 1870s and 1880s. A lot of people were visiting the state. A lot of people came here for medical reasons. Folks suffering from consumption known now as tuberculosis, doctors would recommend they send them down to Florida. So a lot of wealthy visitors were coming to places like St. Augustine, Jacksonville, Tampa, Key West. This was kind of the gateway to the Caribbean, but not much of the interior had been developed. There were problems with infrastructure. There simply were not a lot of railroad systems traversing the state, so it was still fairly rural. So it was Flagler who came in to St. Augustine, noticed this deficiency, at least in infrastructure, and decided to build the Florida East Coast Railroad. But he also built a hotel system called the Florida East Coast Railroad and Hotel System. And that was in order to attract these wealthy northern visitors to explore and enjoy these pristine natural areas of the east coast of Florida, eventually connecting the entire railroad system with Key West, connecting Key West with the mainland, which was a tremendous engineering feat for his time.
Florida was suddenly a very desirable place for citizens all across the U.S. to move. They would do much to differentiate Florida from the rest of the South in a myriad of ways. One of the best exemplifiers of this distinction would be Florida's, and the entire South's, first woman representative in Congress, Ruth Bryan Owen. By the time Ruth Owen won her first House race in 1926, she was a widow, a divorcee, a world traveler, and a filmmaker. While she lost the previous election, this time it was different. She had made a great effort to get her message across by talking to dozens of newspapers, and she managed to beat the 7-term incumbent in the primaries by over 14,000 votes. From there, she easily beat her opponent in the general election. However, due to the Arcane Cable Act, because Owen married a foreign man, she had lost her citizenship and had only recovered it in 1925, less than the 7 years required by the Constitution to run for the House of Representatives. Owen argued hard against the deficient law, leading to its amendment and Owen being sworn in for the 71st Congress. As a representative, Owen was committed to the will of the people. She cared for what her constituents believed before what she herself believed in. She fought for farmers and families and even voted to repeal the 18th Amendment despite being dry herself. Despite her dedication to her constituents, Owen was defeated in the 1932 primaries by James Wilcox, who capitalized on her increasingly unpopular support for prohibition. She took her defeat in stride, though, writing a poem in her last months in office, The Last Will and Testament of a Lame Duck. But that would not be the end of Owen's political career. She would serve as the U.S.'s ambassador to Norway under her family friend FDR. She was the first female ambassador of the United States.
The daughter of famous American politician William Jennings Bryan first got into politics in the 1920s. She ran for election to the U.S. House of Representatives. She lost very narrowly, but ran again in 1930 and actually won, becoming the first female representative to the U.S. Congress from Florida, and actually the first one in the South. She had a very interesting career while she was in Congress and was dedicated to her constituents. And that's probably best illustrated in her views on prohibition, which she was absolutely for prohibition, but her constituents were not. So she actually voted for the repeal of prohibition in the early 1930s. She went on to serve as an ambassador. So she caught the political bug, and she really followed in her father's footsteps and continued for many years after her time in Congress and worked as an ambassador overseas, but was again dedicated to her life in public service, which was a testament to her father's legacy.
Florida is a state like no other. It was the work of countless people, some changing it in big ways, some changing it in small ways, to make it what it is today. To every one of those people who changed it for the better, we should be thankful. These were just some of the heroes of Florida history.